The 8th of May, 1945, 23 minutes to 3 in the afternoon. A provisional prisoner of war cage near the shattered German town of Ries, on the banks of the Rhine. Lieutenant Greta Hoffmann, 26 years old, a nurse attached to the German 12th Army, stood amongst 347 other German women, all captured in the final, sputtering collapse of the Reich. They had marched over 55 miles in 4 days, with no organized provision of food, no clean water, sleeping in ditches and the hollowed-out shells of bombed farmhouses. Their uniforms were torn, caked with the dried mud of their nation's ruin and flecked with the dark, rust-colored stains of blood, some of it their own, some of it belonging to men they could not save. The air hung thick and heavy with the acrid smell of sweat, fear, and a deep, gnawing despair. It was a stench so palpable that the British Guards, weary Tommies from the Highland Division, maintained a deliberate distance of a good 15 feet. Greta looked at the faces of the women around her, a gallery of exhaustion and defeat. Cheeks were hollow, eyes sunken into dark, bruised pits of bone. Some women limped on feet swollen to twice their size, with open, weeping sores where their military-issue boots had ground the skin away to raw flesh. For 6 long years, the relentless machinery of Reich propaganda had told them precisely what to expect should they fall into the hands of the Western Allies. Rape, torture, summary execution. The propaganda minister, Dr. Goebbels, had been chillingly clear in his broadcasts. The British, he had screeched over the airwaves, were brutes without honor, mercenaries, and criminals who would treat German womanhood with the same savage depravity as the Soviets in the East. Greta had seen the horrifying photographs from the Eastern Front, read the pamphlets, and listened to the fervent testimonies of soldiers who swore they had witnessed British atrocities with their own eyes. What she did not know, what she could not possibly have known, was that almost every word of it was a meticulously crafted lie. The truth she was about to discover would bring her to tears, for reasons she could never have imagined. A British sergeant, a man from the 51st Highland Infantry Division, approached the huddled group, an interpreter at his side. He was a formidable figure, Sergeant Arthur Sterling, 31 years of age and built like a Highland oak. He stood 6'2" in his hobnailed boots and carried a solid 15 stone on his frame, with arms as thick as fence posts. Tucked neatly into the webbing on his belt was the slender, deadly form of a Fairbairn-Sykes fighting knife. At the sight of it, Greta felt her heart become a frantic triphammer against her ribs. Instinctively, she took a half-step back, a small, futile retreat. The women around her pressed closer together, a flock of frightened starlings seeking safety in numbers, their collective fear a living thing in the chilly afternoon air. Sergeant Sterling noted the fear, his expression unchanging. His was a face weathered by the North African sun and the Normandy bocage, etched with a deep weariness that went beyond mere physical exhaustion. He raised his hands slowly, palms open, a universal gesture of calm that needed no translation. The interpreter's voice was flat, neutral. "We need to inspect each prisoner. It is standard procedure. Please, form a single line." The women remained frozen, a tableau of silent terror. Sterling let out a long, slow sigh, the sound of a man who had a job to do and simply wanted to get on with it. He walked directly towards Greta, who stood at the front of the group. "You first," the interpreter stated, his gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder. "And if you wish to understand how a single, simple action could unravel 6 years of carefully woven Nazi lies, do consider clicking that like button. It truly helps us bring these vital stories from the archives to light, revealing the truth that so often lies buried beneath the grand narratives of war." Greta trembled as the big sergeant drew near. She could not take her eyes off the knife. Its design was not that of a brutish field tool, it was a stiletto, an instrument of silent, efficient killing. The blade was a wicked sliver of steel, nearly 7 inches long, the brass hilt intricately ringed for a perfect grip. Sterling stopped barely 2 feet from her. His face, lean and hard, showed no emotion at all. "Lift your arms," he ordered, his voice a low rumble, translated a moment later by the interpreter. Slowly, Greta obeyed. Her hands shook so violently she could barely keep them raised. Sterling's gaze was not on her face, but on her uniform. Her grey military dress was ripped in several places. A dark, stiff stain marked the left shoulder, a memento from 3 days prior when she had knelt to staunch the bleeding of a boy who looked no older than 17. But more importantly, after 4 days of marching through the rubble of Germany, her uniform was infested. Greta and the other prisoners had slept in abandoned barns, in bombed-out cellars, in any shell of a building that offered a sliver of shelter from the elements. Lice were inevitable. The British called them seam squirrels, and Sterling could see them now, tiny dark specks moving in the seams of the Feldgrau wall. He reached down and drew the Fairbairn-Sykes knife from its sheath. The rasp of steel against leather was shockingly loud in the tense silence. Greta let out a choked cry. "Bitter, Nain. Please, no." She tried to recoil, but a British corporal stepped up behind her, his hands closing firmly but not cruelly on her upper arms, holding her in place. Sterling stepped forward. Greta squeezed her eyes shut, tears streaming down her filthy cheeks. She braced herself for the searing pain, for the ultimate humiliation, for the final, terrible confirmation that all the propaganda had been true. Then she felt the knife. The cold, flat steel touched her right shoulder. With one swift, practiced movement, Sterling sliced through the fabric of her sleeve, from the shoulder seam right down to the cuff. Nothing more. Greta's eyes flew open, her mind reeling in confusion. Sterling repeated the action on her other sleeve. Then, with the same deliberate care, he used the tip of the blade to cut the side seams of her tunic, from under her arms down to her waist. The uniform fell open, revealing the plain cotton undershirt she wore beneath. Her modesty was intact. Sterling wiped the blade on his trouser leg and slid the Fairbairn-Sykes back into its sheath. "Take the uniform off," the interpreter commanded. "You are to be issued clean clothing and will proceed for delousing." Greta stood frozen, unable to process the words. She simply did not understand. The interpreter repeated himself, his tone patient. "We are not harming you. The uniform is crawling with lice. Typhus. If it is not removed and destroyed now, the entire camp will become contaminated. You will be given clean clothes, a hot shower, and your personal effects will be disinfected. It is sanitary protocol." Greta stared at Sergeant Sterling. The big Scotsman was already moving towards the next woman in line, ready to perform the exact same clinical procedure. There was no malice, no humiliation, only a detached, methodical efficiency. Greta's tears began to flow again, but now they were born not of fear, but of something far more complex, a bewildering cocktail of relief, confusion, and a feeling she couldn't yet name, a nascent sense of shame. A deep, burning shame for ever having believed the lies. The British had not come to violate them, they had come to disinfect them. This wasn't some spontaneous act of battlefield chivalry, it was standard procedure, laid down in the King's regulations and reinforced by directives from the War Office itself regarding the proper handling of prisoners under the Geneva Convention. Every captured enemy combatant was to undergo a delousing process within the first 24 hours. Step 1. A visual inspection for signs of contagious disease or infestation. Step 2. Removal of infested uniforms, often by cutting them off with a standard-issue knife to prevent the aerosolization of lice and their eggs. Step 3. A mandatory shower with hot water and strong, carbolic soap for a minimum of 10 minutes. Step 4. A medical inspection by a Royal Army Medical Corps orderly for sores, infections, or wounds requiring treatment. Step 5. The provision of clean clothing, either prisoner fatigues or, in emergencies, surplus British battle dress. The entire program was designed not out of sentimentality, but out of grim, hard-won military pragmatism. The British Army, with its long history in colonial territories and the bitter memory of the trenches, knew that disease was a far more prolific killer than bullets. Lice carry typhus, and a typhus epidemic sweeping through a crowded POW camp could kill hundreds, prisoners and guards alike, in a matter of weeks. The British weren't being kind, they were being sensible. But for the German women who had braced themselves for barbarity, this cold pragmatism felt indistinguishable from mercy. If this stark collision of propaganda and reality is as astonishing to you as it was to Greta, perhaps write Rees in the comments below, to mark the spot where one woman's world began to turn. Greta numbly shed the remains of her tattered uniform. All around her, 346 other women did the same. They stood in their undergarments, vulnerable and shivering in the spring air, waiting for the next horror to unfold. Instead, a group of women in smart grey dresses with scarlet capes appeared, carrying stacks of towels and bars of soap. They were nurses of the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service. Women. Not soldiers. Not men with violent intent. A sister, a nurse in her late 20s with tired but compassionate eyes, approached Greta. She introduced herself as Sister Eleanor Vance. In her hands, she held a clean, rough towel. "The showers are this way," she said in English, her voice gentle. The interpreter translated. "Hot water, carbolic soap. Take as long as you need." Greta found she could not move. The tears were back, blurring her vision. "Why?" she asked in a broken German whisper. "Why are you treating us like this? You are supposed to hate us." The interpreter relayed the question to Sister Vance. The British nurse looked Greta directly in the eyes, a flicker of something unreadable in her expression. "Because you are prisoners of war, my dear, not livestock," she replied, her voice firm but not unkind. "And we are not the Gestapo." The answer struck Greta with the force of a physical blow. For 6 years, she had been told the British were monsters. For 6 years, she had been told that Germany was the beacon of civilization, defending itself against a tide of barbarism. Yet here she stood, being treated with more dignity and care by her sworn enemies than she had been by her own collapsing regime in the final, desperate months of the war. The showers were an improvised affair, a series of stalls walled with canvas and set upon wooden duckboards to keep them out of the mud. Pipes ran from a Lora-mounted water boiler that puffed steam into the cold German air. Greta stepped inside one of the stalls and turned the simple tap. Hot water streamed down over her, and the shock of it made her gasp. It was the first time she had felt properly hot water on her skin in 7 weeks. She wept openly under the spray, the tears mingling with the water, washing away not just the layers of grime and dried blood, but something else, something deeper. The ideology itself felt as if it were dissolving and running down the drain at her feet. The soap smelled harshly of chemicals, but it was clean. It was the smell of sanitation, of order. She spent 18 minutes in that shower. No one hurried her, no one watched her. When she finally emerged, blinking in the daylight, Sister Vance was waiting. She handed Greta a dry towel, clean underthings, and a simple uniform of grey cotton prisoner's fatigues. It was not elegant, but it was clean. It had no lice. Sister Vance then pressed something else into her hand, a small tin of antiseptic ointment and a field dressing. "For the blisters on your feet," the interpreter explained. "See to them now, before they turn septic." Greta stared at the small package. In Germany, for the last few months of the war, even seriously wounded soldiers often went without enough bandages. And here, her enemies were giving her medical supplies to treat mere blisters. The propaganda had not prepared her for this. Nothing had prepared her for the quiet humiliation of discovering that everything she had been taught to believe, everything she had feared, was a lie. If you are still with us, you are a part of this story's telling. Do subscribe to our program to ensure you do not miss the conclusion of Greta's remarkable journey. The treatment of the German prisoners in the camp at Riess was not exceptional, it was standard. All prisoners of war captured by the British forces in Europe went through this same process. Delousing, medical inspection, clean clothing, and assignment to barracks with cots and blankets. And then came something else, something that stunned every single German prisoner without exception: food. That evening, at 1800 hours, the women were led to a large marquee tent serving as a provisional canteen. They sat at folding tables on wooden benches. Each prisoner was issued a metal tray holding a steaming ladle of bully beef stew, thick with potatoes and carrots, 2 dense biscuits of hardtack, and a mug of scaldingly hot, sweet tea. The total calories would have been close to 2,000. For context, civilian rations in the final weeks of the Reich had plummeted to less than 1,000 calories per day. Many of these women had not eaten a proper hot meal in weeks. Greta stared down at her tray. Steam rose from the stew, carrying the scent of real meat and vegetables. She looked around at the other prisoners. Every face held the same expression of stunned disbelief. An older woman, perhaps 45, began to weep quietly as she ate, her tears dripping into her stew. Another simply sat and stared at her plate, as if afraid that touching the food would make it vanish. Greta ate slowly, deliberately. Each mouthful was a revelation. The British were feeding their prisoners better than the Reich had fed its own soldiers in the end. How do you continue to hate an enemy who feeds you after capturing you? How do you justify 6 years of brutal warfare when the enemy you were told was a barbarian treats you with more humanity than your own government? These were the questions churning in Greta's mind, and she had no answers. The humane treatment of prisoners of war by the British was not born of pure altruism, it was a cornerstone of strategy. Directives from the War Office, echoing the sentiments of the Allied High Command, were clear. Every well-treated prisoner was a living, breathing refutation of Nazi propaganda. Every prisoner was a potential agent for weakening the enemy's will to fight. And it worked. Captured German soldiers wrote letters home, describing their treatment. These letters were often intercepted by German intelligence, but they were too numerous to censor them all. The word spread. By the end of April 1945, entire German units were seeking to surrender specifically to the Western Allies, desperate to avoid capture by the Red Army. They did so not because they thought the British were weak, but because they knew they would be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Greta spent 7 weeks in the prisoner of war camp near Riess before being transferred to a more permanent facility in the British occupation zone. During those weeks, she was never struck, never abused, never tortured. She was put to work in the camp's field kitchen, peeling potatoes and preparing meals for her fellow prisoners. She received the same rations as the British guards. When one of the blisters on her foot did become infected, she was sent to the camp infirmary. A British doctor from the Royal Army Medical Corps treated her with penicillin, the wonder drug that Germany had tried and failed to mass-produce for years. Slowly, methodically, reality replaced propaganda. The British were not monsters. Germany had not only lost a military war, it had lost the moral one, too. In September of 1945, Greta was released. The Reich was gone. There was no country to return to. She remained in the British zone, finding work as a nurse in a hospital that treated German civilians and former prisoners of war with nowhere to go. In 1947, she emigrated to the United Kingdom as part of a program seeking skilled medical workers to help build the new National Health Service. In 1952, she became a British citizen. She worked as a nurse in a London hospital for 34 years. She married a British veteran of the war. They had 2 children. She never forgot that moment by the Rhine, the moment Sergeant Sterling cut away her uniform with his fighting knife. The moment she had expected brutality and received sanitary procedure. The moment an entire edifice of lies had crumbled in the face of a simple, pragmatic reality. Greta Hoffmann died in 1998, at the age of 79. In her will, she left a letter for her grandchildren, explaining why she had chosen to become a British citizen. The letter read, in part, "I was taught to hate the British. I was told they were barbarians without honor. But when I fell into their hands, they did not assault me, they did not torture me. They gave me a hot shower, clean clothes, and a warm meal. And that simple act of decency destroyed 6 years of lies in 30 seconds. I chose to make my home in Britain because I learned that a nation which treats its defeated enemies with honor is a nation that values humanity above ideology." Now, not every German prisoner was treated perfectly. There were abuses. There were camps where conditions, particularly in the chaotic spring of 1945 when millions of surrendering soldiers overwhelmed Allied logistics, were terrible. But the standard, the official policy, the documented intent, was for humane treatment in accordance with the Geneva Convention. And that standard saved lives, not just the lives of prisoners, but the lives of Allied soldiers who, when captured, were often treated better because the Germans knew their own men were being treated with dignity. This reciprocity in the treatment of prisoners is one of the few, hard-won moral victories in a war defined by its horrors. So, what are your thoughts on this powerful story of propaganda versus reality? Were you aware of the stark contrast between what many Germans were told to expect and what they actually experienced as prisoners of the Western Allies? Do let us know your thoughts in the comments, and be sure to subscribe to our channel. Every week, we bring you verified, compelling histories that have shaped our world. Please, do press the notification